This is the Tuesday, April 21st, 2020 work session of the Portland City Council. Under Portland City Code and state law, the City Council is holding this meeting electronically. All members of the council are attending remotely by phone, and the city has made several avenues available for the public to listen to the audio broadcast of this meeting. The public can also provide written testimony to council by emailing the council clerk, although this is a work session, so there is no testimony. The council is taking these steps as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to limit in-person contact and promote social distancing. The pandemic is an emergency that threatens the public health, safety, and welfare, which requires us to meet remotely by electronic communications. Thank you again for your patience, flexibility, and understanding as we manage through this difficult situation to do the city's business. Colleagues, thank you for making time for this work session today. Today's meeting is going to be a two-part meeting. The first part of our time is dedicated to a briefing and a discussion about the federal government's response to COVID-19. Then we're going to transition to a conversation about the budget. We'll hear from our city budget office what the latest forecast shows and how we're rethinking the budget process to make sure we're taking the right actions at the right time in response to the most current information that we have available. You now have a copy of the agenda and the handout in your email, and you can follow along as you prefer. I want to take just a brief moment before we begin to publicly thank today's presenters. We have Elizabeth Edwards, who of course is the director of the Government Relations Office, Sheila Craig, who's our lead coordinator for the financial side of our COVID-19 response, and Jessica Kennard, our city budget director. The entire city leadership team has done what I think is really extraordinary work over the last month as this crisis has hit the community. And these three in particular have shouldered much more than their fair share of the work. So I want to thank them. So thank you, each of you, for your leadership and for being here today to get us up to speed on these important items. Elizabeth, do you want to kick us off? Elizabeth Edwards, paging Elizabeth Edwards.
She may be on mute.
Elizabeth, are you muted?
I am unmuted by the host.
There you are. All right, good. How are you this morning?
Good. It wouldn't be a council presentation without some microphone issues for me. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and commissioners. For the record, my name is Elizabeth Edwards. I'm the director of the Office of Government Relations. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm coming to you from our Emergency Coordination Center. I'm joined by Sheila Craig, our grant manager for the City of Portland, and we'll be presenting together today, along with Jian Kim, who has put together one of the most beautiful PowerPoints I've ever seen. So a big thank you to Jian. We also have a number of bureau directors on the line who will be able to answer questions about their specific programs that may come up over the course of our conversation this morning. And I personally want to thank all of them for being with us and taking the time. So through this presentation, we intend to lay a shared foundation for what we know to date on actions the federal government has taken, as well as look into the crystal ball of what next steps may be in the queue. We'll cover at a high level what funds are coming to the state and our region, and then we'll drill down into the CARES Act, and specifically the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which I'm very pleased to announce has directed $114 million to the City of Portland. We will discuss and we'll talk about some of the known and unknown parameters for what we can use this funding for, and we'll talk about possible next steps on the ground. In the agenda that you all have, we include taking up highlights of the packages during the middle of our discussion. I'm going to recommend that we move those to the end, the discussion around housing stability, worker stability, those different industries. I think we're going to have more content to actually talk through those. So just one quick adjustment to our agenda this morning. Really appreciate the opportunity, and of course, this should be a conversation, so please chime in with questions as we move along. We'll navigate the awkwardness of doing this remotely. And at the end of our time together, it's our hope that you and all the folks that are listening at home really feel like they have a strong understanding of the federal actions to date the impact of those actions on our state and our region, and that they have some sense of potential next steps to address gaps in the system as it exists today. So if we move to the next slide. So this is an overview of federal responses to date, and we're going to start really broad and we're going to work our way a little bit more narrowly. We talk about 3 big bills, but actually there have been 4 major actions that have driven the federal response to coronavirus at the federal level. There's 3 pieces of relief legislation, each containing funding and policies, as well as the National Disaster Declaration, which allows certain reimbursements. The handout that you have that Kristen Johnson so beautifully put together is a compendium, a list of all of the expenditures nationally to date, organized by issue area. This is for your reference as to the scale of the investment so far, and I just want to say a big, big thank you to Kristen for pulling all of this together. It'll be a really handy document for our conversation at the end of the presentation. I'm going to go through in chronological order of the different actions during the course of the month of March, because I have a very linear mind. On March 6th, way back on March 6th, Congress passed the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. This was the initial funding for the public health response, and it was $8.3 billion. A few highlights just to refresh everyone's memories. It had $100 million for community health centers. It had money for therapeutic development, vaccine development, purchase of additional personal protective equipment. There was $950 million for state and local health departments that was dispersed through the CDC. The state of Oregon received $7.2 million from that dispersal. And there were $300 million allocated toward the national distribution of vaccines and treatments. So that was that first package back in March 6th. Just a week later, the president declared a national emergency concerning the novel coronavirus disease COVID-19 outbreak, formal title. That invoked the National Emergencies Act and the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, commonly known as the Stafford Act. This declaration authorizes FEMA to provide eligible applicants with funding to reimburse actions taken to respond to the pandemic. And through the Stafford Act, FEMA provides assistance to states, territories, tribes, local governments, certain nonprofit organizations. I have heard in talking with council offices and in talking with a lot of folks in communities that there is some conflation or confusion that can occur between both the Stafford Act and the CARES funding that we just received, in part because they're both around reimbursements. One important note that I know Sheila and Director Myers are tracking really, really closely is that the Stafford Act reimbursements come back to jurisdictions at 75 cents on the dollar. And those reimbursements may take some time before they arrive. There are some really key distinctions between Stafford Act reimbursement dollars and the CARES Act. So I wanted to highlight that. Now, leaping ahead 5 more days to March 18th, Congress passed the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. This was in order to address the domestic outbreak and included things around policies around paid sick leave, expanding the Family Medical Leave Act, guaranteeing insurance coverage around COVID-19 testing, the first step in expanding unemployment benefits and allocating $1 billion to states for their unemployment programs. And it also provided additional funding for nutrition programs like SNAP, WIC, local food banks, senior nutrition programs, and the like. So then we get to CARES. And there are a couple of items on this slide that look into the crystal ball. We'll come back to that in a future slide. So we're going to go to slide number 3 and dig into the CARES Act. Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security. We love an acronym. This passed on March 27th, and it allocated $2.2 trillion. CARES was designed really to stem the economic hurt that is being experienced by individuals, by state and local governments, small businesses, industries, among others. And this infographic actually comes from NPR. I think it's really helpful for a sense of the scale and possible sources of funding. A few highlights that folks hear about in the news around the CARES Act are the individual payments, that $1,200 plus $500 per child in the household for single filers earning $75,000 or less, or $150,000 is for joint filers, and this is a benefit that phases out for higher income earners. This is also where the Paycheck Protection Program resides, that initial $349 billion loan program of forgivable loans for small businesses. We know that while funding ran out for the program on April 16th, we anticipate a deal this week. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer announced this morning that there is a deal. We will wait to see ink on paper before we get our hopes fully up, but it seems like things are moving expeditiously. If it is according to what we are hearing, it would provide an additional $310 billion in order to recapitalize that Paycheck Protection Program. The CARES Act also further expanded unemployment insurance and benefits, adding an additional $600 per week on top of the unemployment amount as determined by each state. And it also expanded the program to include gig workers and freelancers who previously were not covered by unemployment insurance. CARES Act suspended payments on federal loans through September 30th. This was an extension of an action the administration had taken to suspend payments through May. There's also an allocation of $25 billion to transit agencies and $10 billion to airports. In consultation with TriMet and with PDX, we understand that TriMet has received $175 million as part of their allocation from that $25 billion to transit agencies, and PDX has received $72 million as part of their allocation from the CARES Act. So last but not least, you have this $500 billion for assistance to eligible businesses, states, and municipalities, including the $150 billion Coronavirus Relief Fund. That is the fund that has directed $114 million to the city of Portland. We'll go to the next slide. So this is not an exhaustive slide, and I apologize for how small some of the font is. We want to provide you with a lot of information and context, and sometimes it's hard to find that right balance. But what I hope you'll take away from this is in the far left-hand column is just coronavirus relief funds. So you see $1.635 billion. That is the total allocation to the state of Oregon. Now, the actual state government will be receiving $1.39 billion out of that total. The city of Portland has received $114 million. Washington County will receive $105, and Multnomah County $28 million. In the middle column there, you have some examples of other funding that has flowed to the city of Portland. We know that more is coming, but part of we're waiting on formula dollars, grant opportunities, and the like. So this list will expand. But you have $5.1 million for the Community Development Block Grant, $2.5 million, which may increase for Emergency Solutions Grants, $1.04 million for Burn JAG, which goes to Portland Police, $249,000 for HOPWA, that's Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS. And then on the far right column, these are examples of the scale of dollars that are flowing to our region to cover a wide variety of items, whether it's around public health, transit, and I'll note that the transit and PDX numbers are slightly different just based on conversations versus what was reported in media. That's why there's a discrepancy there. Higher education, emergency management grants, help with voting. So there's a lot of different money flowing from a lot of different sources, and wanted to also show the council both the context of this and let you know that your smart folks in the grants program are tracking it so that we have a sense of sort of what is beginning to hit the state and our region. If we go to the next slide, this one is particular to the Coronavirus Relief Fund. That is the subset of the CARES Act. So one of the key features is this $150 billion. that goes to states, territories, tribal governments, and it's in the language of the bill, it's used for expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19. It is allocated based on population proportions, which is why you see different dollar amounts going to different local governments. Each state across the country has a minimum $1.25 billion allocation, so even those states with relatively small populations still receive that minimum. The eligibility for a local government to apply and certify directly with the federal government was to have a population of over 500,000, which is also how you ended up with the city of Portland, Washington County, and Multnomah County as the local governments eligible to certify directly with the feds. So there have been a lot of questions about this, and I want to be really clear on the record. There are certainly things that are unknown. We continue to wait for additional direction from Treasury. I was really hopeful at the time of this presentation that we would be able to go into a more granular level of detail. But let me share this. The CARES Act requires that payments from this fund only be used to cover expenses that, one, are necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19. Two, that they were not accounted for in the budget most recently approved as of March 27th, 2020. That's the date of enactment of the Act. And three, were incurred during a period that begins March 1st of 2020 and ends December 30, 2020. And I want to put a finer point on it based on the language of the CARES Act and the direction from Treasury to date. Right now, these funds cannot be used for lost revenue. So, and I will circle back on that a little bit later as well. Portland certified with Treasury on April 13th, and I announced earlier that yesterday the city received its allocation of $114 million from Treasury. I am somewhat dismayed that despite having received the funds, we are still waiting on additional guidance that we know is coming from Treasury, and I will just share that frankly, when we scheduled this work session, we didn't anticipate being in this particular situation. But that doesn't mean that there isn't benefit to sharing and discussing what we know, providing this shared context, and especially understanding that guidance is imminent. And hopefully we will be able to follow up with you in very short order with more detailed information as soon as it arrives. And we have the benefit of Sheila, who will be able to cover at a high level some of the elements of what we know about federal grants and parameters that can help inform our thinking about potential next steps. So before I turn things over to Sheila, I want to take a quick, a quick look in the crystal ball. And this is where this is where a lot of caveats, more than usual, will be included. So as I mentioned earlier, on April 16th, the Paycheck Protection Program ran out of funding. Congress has been working over the weekend, and we are hearing that there may be a deal that is imminent. What we know is that hopefully an additional $310 billion will be directed to the Paycheck Protection Program. And that would be split, $250 billion for the program with $60 billion set aside for smaller banks. The package would also have an additional $60 billion for the Small Business Administration's Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, along with $75 billion for hospitals, split between rural and hot zones, and another $25 billion for testing. There's also been a lot of talk about whether this agreement would include additional funding to states, territories, local governments, and or add additional flexibility around the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And I will just share that I've rewritten this section of my notes 3 times already, but here's what we know as of 8 a.m. this morning. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, as I referenced earlier, has announced that a deal has been reached. And additional funding will not be included in the bill, but there may be some additional flexibility for the funds. And there may be an ability to use those funds for revenue shortfalls. So now we are waiting for Treasury and Congress for additional direction, both of which should be imminent. I feel like a broken record. I will also share that, you know, we haven't seen draft language, so we are operating off of rumor, which is in part the currency of Washington, D.C., but I would be really hesitant to bank on any of this until ink is on paper, because things are just truly so fluid right now. There are also a lot of conversations about a stimulus package, right? A true economic stimulus package that would be largely infrastructure focused. It's our understanding that, yes?
Could I interrupt before you leave the CARES Act?
Yeah.
I have a question. Representative Bonamici had been working to ensure that any additional PPP dollars that were set aside had a $1.5 billion set aside for minority and women-owned businesses because of the lack of opportunity in the first CARES Act for those types of small businesses. Do you know anything about whether or not that language is included?
Commissioner, I have not seen anything about that language being included. What I will share is that what we know is just at a high level. We should get a lot more detail, hopefully by later today. The Senate is playing a big role in negotiating this particular deal, and there's been heavy pressure for a bipartisan agreement, which is part of the reason why state and locals have also been in part left behind in this package. It allows them to conduct their voting in such a way that allows for more distancing. One thing that I do know is included, which is not the $1.3 billion for PPE for BIPOC businesses, is $60 billion of the $310 that will be going to the Paycheck Protection Program will be for small banks. And so for institutions that tend to work with businesses that don't have relationships with the really big banks. And, you know, we obviously saw some of the reporting about who was some of Fortune 500 companies taking advantage of the PPP. And so there's been pushback, and Congress is working to address that.
Will it include credit unions?
I believe so, but let me confirm that. I don't know how small bank is defined.
Commissioner Udaley.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Director Edwards. I have a few questions. You mentioned the reforms for unemployment insurance, but it's my understanding that independent contractors and the self-employed are still not able to access unemployment. Do you have any kind of timeline on when they might be able to do so?
Commissioner, my understanding is that the challenge is largely with the state in updating a very antiquated system. And I know that they are working very hard to add new programming into this old system. But I can circle back with your office with better information about the timing as far as getting those dollars out the door to gig and freelance workers.
It would be really helpful to be able to communicate that to the public. That's a significant portion of our workers and small business owners who have been struggling through this crisis with no relief. And it's getting pretty grim out there. item is more of a comment or direction that I'd really like to see us take. Hundreds of millions of dollars of those SBA loans went to publicly traded companies, which by definition are not small businesses. And it is my strong opinion that those loans should be revoked and redistributed, and that we need stronger guidelines on who qualifies for small business loans. Is that something that we can add to our agenda?
Commissioner, you and your colleagues are the boss. If that's something you would like added to the agenda, absolutely.
Well, I guess, I mean, just to be honest, I'm feeling overwhelmed by the volume of information and when and how to respond. So I guess, yes, I want to put that on the table as a top priority for the city of Portland if I have my colleagues' support. It's just unconscionable to me that these businesses of publicly traded businesses with tens of millions of dollars or more in reserve are sucking up funds that were meant to provide relief to our small businesses, which are the backbone of our economy and employ the majority of our workers. So my next question is about mortgage forbearance. You didn't touch on that, but it's part of the CARES or CARE package. I am wondering if there's any guidance to lending institutions on how they must accommodate payback, because I'm hearing from homeowners that their banks have said, sure, you can get forbearance for 90 days or for the duration of the emergency, but when it's over, you will owe that lump sum. We're not offering any payback terms. And with a third of our homeowners already cost burdened by their housing costs, they will not be able to do that. Average income homeowners will not be able to do that. They need reasonable payback plan that's either spread out over months or years, or they need those months tacked onto the back end of their mortgage. And is there any specifics in either the first iteration of this Relief Act or the upcoming 2.0 that would provide more guidance?
So, Commissioner, I can share in the next wave, the 2.0, there is not language, to the best of our knowledge, regarding what happens after the forbearance period is exhausted. And I know this is something that we are certainly tackling within the state and also nationally, and that's a very active conversation. You also have an issue around mortgages that are not backed by the federal government, and folks with those mortgages have, frankly, different rules than people who have mortgages that are owned by the federal government. I know that the Housing Bureau is thinking really deeply on this subject, and I'm happy to follow up with them on possible next steps.
Great. I mean, that's another issue I want to flag for a legislative priority, because we are going to see a rash of foreclosures when this crisis is over if banks are allowed to impose these kinds of unreasonable payback plans. Next question is about public safety and disaster funds. You touched on that, and I understand there's a lack of clarity about what we can spend it on. I think I understand the basic constraints, but could that money be spent on hotel vouchers for people experiencing homelessness? And the rationale is that it's a public health and safety issue, and it wasn't budgeted for prior to 3/17.
So just to make sure I heard you correctly, the question was whether or not we could use these coronavirus relief fund dollars in order for hotel vouchers
Yes.
or other sheltering options. So that's we've certainly gotten that question before. I think we are waiting for some additional guidance, and I know Sheila can speak to what we know about grants in general that may be able to shed light on whether or not that is a potential use at this point in time.
That would be a priority for me, first and foremost, because of the public health and safety issue and just the health and dignity of these individuals, but also because our, how do I put this? Because we have not significantly increased our shelter capacity, it is contributing to a lot of unsafe, unhealthy, and destructive behavior on our streets. And I've traveled around the city a couple times, just driving to kind of check out neighborhoods and see what it looks like out there. And the my greatest concern is for people who are living unsheltered and their ability to access hygiene facilities, to eat, and to maintain safe social distancing. So that would be a priority for me, as well as PPE for vulnerable members of the public who may not have access to equipment and emergency food assistance, because we know that especially for people experiencing homelessness, a lot of their places that they've traditionally gotten food are closed. So we have more people going hungry during this crisis.
Could I suggest we let Elizabeth get through the presentation and hold questions until the end? Because my suspicion is she might answer some of them.
That's fine with me. My questions all pertained to slides that had already gone by, and I was concerned that we were moving on to new subjects before I had a chance to ask my questions, but I can hold till the end.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, so maybe I'll wrap up 2 quick bullets before I turn it over to Sheila. And we're really going to land on CARES and spend the remainder of our time on this. So I don't want you to fear that we're blowing past it. This is more just for context and talking about future legislative actions, because there will be some interplay at the end of the day. Stimulus package, real quick. Our understanding that a stimulus package largely focused around infrastructure will be a priority once the country is on a little bit more secure footing. We flatten the curve on the other side of the public health crisis, and that it would likely be very expansive. So service, transportation, rail, transit, airports, drinking water, wastewater, and broadband, and even possibly housing. And then I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to also mention the state before I turn things over to Sheila, because last night the Joint Emergency Board posted an agenda for this Thursday. The Emergency Board is an extension of the Joint Ways and Means Committee, and they can meet when the legislature is not in session. They currently have $53 million in their control. They're not expected to spend all of this at this upcoming convening, but items that they will take up are safe shelter and rental assistance, emergency business assistance, domestic violence and sexual violence, the Oregon Worker Relief Fund, human resources positions to support BOLI, long-term care worker COVID-19 testing and training, critical access to hospital stabilization loans, and some additional dollars to the Department of Administrative Services for the Coronavirus Relief Fund. So it's this will be the next sort of state action. There's been a lot of talk about special session. That at this point it's not likely until after the May revenue forecast on the 20th. So with this, I'm going to turn things over to Sheila Craig, Grants Manager for the City of Portland, to discuss the grants management strategy, and we can close with a continued discussion around the highlighted areas called out in the agenda and the handout, which were developed based on themes and conversations with council offices. And I think Sheila may also be able to speak to some of the shelter expenses and other things that have gone out the door.
Well, thankfully we have Elizabeth to track all these various buckets of money that may or may not be available to us. Because I live in a world of, we received $114 million, and how do we track those expenditures and how do we stay in compliance with the federal government? So I'm here today to make you feel confident that we have a process in place at the city that will be able to track these expenditures accurately and meet the federal requirements. Currently, the City of Portland, in our 18-19 audit, we reported $98 million in federal expenditures. That's just to give you an idea of, we do this every day. So receiving $114 million from the federal government is something we do all the time, and it's not scaring us that we will not be able to meet their requirements. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot today about this $114 million other than the information Elizabeth gave you earlier. So what we are doing is we're just treating it as all other federal funding because that's what we know today. We know it will have rigorous oversight, potentially from the OIG, Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, Congressional Oversight Commission, and we know it will be included in our single audit, and we'll get our external auditors. It will most likely be a major program because the amount of expenditures we will have in a fiscal year. Look at my notes here. So we will follow the 2 CFR 200. I call that our kind of our federal guidance Bible. That's what I like to call it. And we have to follow that. And luckily for us, the City of Portland, our processes and policies align well with the 2 CFR 200. We're reviewing that on an annual basis, making sure that our policies are in alignment with the federal government. Again, we're waiting to receive the requirements, the regulations for this $114 million. We're hoping that we'll be more flexible than the typical grants. But until we know that, we'll continue to move along, tracking it as we do all of our federal funding. We also are looking at, we're tracking our current expenditures related to this event, and we'll be aligning those with the best match for reimbursement. There are various buckets of funding out there, and we are tracking everything closely. At the beginning of the event, we were looking more for FEMA reimbursement because that's what we knew we had from the beginning. We're tracking everything in FEMA buckets. But we will be looking to all the various funding sources to align those as best we can with our current expenditures and our projected expenditures.
That includes things like the personal protective equipment,
Correct.
like the shelter space.
All expenditures, which include, and mostly what we've seen is PPE, like cleaning supplies, hand sanitizer, and then kind of our joint efforts with the county on sheltering services. And we're also working on what we call a food security program right now to address some of those food needs across the City of Portland. So our next steps. Is this me or you?
This is you.
Oh. So as we said, we're waiting on the Treasury guidance on allowable expenses for the local relief funds. CAO OMF resumes the Bureau needs assessment for current and projected CARES Act funding expenses. And the city develops a decision-making process to review and allocate CARES Act funding to be spent by December 30th. And that needs assessment was sent out to Bureau directors was that last week? Last week. And we extended the deadline on that, and we'll be reaching out to Bureau directors with more information as we receive it.
So this council work session is an opportunity to get a sense of where your heads are at, what you're hearing from your constituents, and we're happy to share our best advice as of 10:15 a.m. on April 21st. So that concludes the actual presentation. We can go back to any slides in here. Really wanted to drill down into CARES based on the information that we know to date, and we'll go through the highlights from the three packages, the different elements that are called out in the agenda. Happy to talk about any of the subsets around housing stability, worker stability, employer stability, arts and culture, mental health, transportation, tourism, public safety, and first response. We've done a little bit of a deeper dive on that, but would like that to be almost a choose your own adventure at this point about where council would like to spend more of their time.
Commissioner Udaley had a question.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had a couple more items, and I'm going to save one for later. The last thing I wanted to talk about was just how inadequate the PPP loans are and how they are not appropriate for many of our hardest hit businesses. We have asked non-essential businesses to close down. And for those businesses that rely on people gathering in one space, they were the first to close down. They are among the hardest hit, and they will be among the last to reopen. So attaching these loans to a requirement that they bring back employees, to achieve forgiveness before this crisis is even over is absurd. I mean, it just feels like a cruel joke. And I am gravely concerned for our restaurant and retail businesses, as well as our music venues, which I've brought up before. We could lose virtually every locally owned music venue in the city if we don't help these businesses access some meaningful relief. So again, not a question, more of a comment. And I'll just sum up my priorities. We've taken some first steps to stabilize residential and commercial tenants. It is not nearly enough to ensure that they are not evicted, foreclosed on, or bankrupted at the end of this crisis. So that's one of my top priorities. We need to get people off of our streets. So once we have clarity on how those relief funds can be spent, my priority is going to be to get everyone safely sheltered who is currently living on the streets, and not leaving them. You know, a lot of shelters shut down in the morning and don't open till the evening. There's nowhere for people to go. Libraries are closed, businesses are closed, community centers are closed. We have to provide people places where they can actually stay and shelter in place and have access to basic amenities. I think I will just leave it at that for now. I'm interested to hear what my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to see if Commissioner Fritz still had a question. Her hand was up early. I have questions, but I'm willing to wait until she has had an opportunity.
Thanks, Commissioner. No, I was just hoping that we could get through the presentation. So I'm digesting it at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Elizabeth, for that very thorough presentation. So I have kind of a couple of questions about how we will prioritize those the usage of the local $114 million. And I guess we don't know really how we would prioritize it until the rules have been written. It is hopeful that we will know soon, is what you have said. So I share some of Commissioner Udaley's concern about the first relief packages and who was helped and who wasn't. And I'm wondering in the second package, whether or not you believe we have the authority to influence at the federal level, kind of what the accountability measures that would be in place. So for example, there was no demographic data on who got those loans. The first time, there was no expectation that banks would reach out to new clients and not just make it available for clients that they had. I am pleased to say that I know at least a couple of nonprofits who were able to access those funds, but it's a handful of, I think, good organizations as compared to who already has been able to get those funds. Without a different type of accountability system in place, regular people will be left out of this package once again. And so I would be curious in what kind of tactics we plan to utilize to make sure that this package actually serves people and not the big corporations that appear to have been the beneficiaries of the last one.
Commissioner Fritz, then back to Commissioner Udaley.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. There was an article in the LA Times today or yesterday about U.S. citizens who are filed jointly with non-U.S. citizens don't get the stimulus money, the individual allocation, and neither do their children. Is there something we can do to correct that, either with our local money or with advocating for in the next package that every U.S. citizen gets the assistance, and that people who aren't U.S. citizens also get assistance?
That is what the Legislative Employee Relief Fund is seeking to do at the state level. Let me also say, I read also that ex-felons are not entitled to the relief fund as well. And so there's a broad community that will not get any financial assistance based on any federal package so far. And the question is whether the legislature in their special session will fund it, or what resources will we locally have to provide some temporary support.
Thank you. Could I get Elizabeth's input on that too, please?
Happily. And Commissioner Hardesty covered some of what I was going to say. The Oregon Worker Relief Fund is targeted at filling that gap specifically around undocumented Oregonians and making sure that they're able to receive some relief that the federal government is not providing. The emergency board will be meeting this Thursday. It is one of the items on their agenda. We don't have a sense of the scale of the investment that they may make to date. My understanding is that the initial ask was upwards of $124 million that would cover about a month's worth of support for 74,000 Oregonians. The emergency board only has $53 million at its disposal. So we know that it will be some amount far short of the actual need. And we're doing that gaps analysis to look at other folks who are not having their, who are not receiving benefits from the federal government either intentionally or unintentionally. And so we are working on that gaps analysis. Prosper Portland has a task force that is also working on this analysis along with members of the community and Andrew McGaugh with Work Systems, Inc. So we have some really bright minds and folks with lived experiences helping to inform where those gaps are. As far as the mixed household issue, this is something that we can look at further at the federal level. My understanding is that it has to do with tax identification numbers and perhaps who the head of the household is for filing. We will do some additional digging and get back to you as to whether or not there's an opportunity to make a fix at the federal side, or if the relief is going to come from state and local.
Yeah, thank you. That particularly at the federal level, having been in a household that had a U.S. citizen and a permanent resident who was not a United States citizen and who was living under the poverty level for several years, that is just, even for the current administration, that seems just beyond the pale. And if you're filing taxes, you have to have a Social Security number. So why the fact that one of them is not a United States citizen makes a difference, even to United States citizens, is just beyond the pale. So thank you for your answer and also for working on that. Thank you.
Commissioner Hardesty.
I'm sorry, Mayor. I didn't put my hand down. I've had my questions answered. Thank you.
Excellent. Any further feedback for either of our presenters? All right.
Mayor, I guess, Mayor,
go ahead.
I do have a question for you. I mean, I once again, there seems to be a lot of money floating around, but nobody has a really clear picture of how those dollars can or will be invested. So I guess the good news is that we're getting federal money. The bad news is that we can't spend it unless we know how we can spend it. What will be our process to actually prioritize once we know what's within the parameters, what resources we put to what?
Yeah, and we were actually hoping to do that exercise today. That's what this work session was originally scheduled to do, was to go through and establish priorities based on the parameters of the act. And I don't want to be too hard on the federal government. This is the largest deployment of federal resources in U.S. history, but it is unfortunate we now have $114 million sitting before us, but we don't actually know how we can use it because the rules have not yet been published. So the answer is twofold. Number one, I will be working with you as colleagues. Number two, we'll be coordinating with Multnomah County, because my expectation is that there's going to be some shared responsibility there. Third, we're going to engage the Bureau directors in terms of what sort of leveraging opportunities there might be with those funds. And that's the process. But unfortunately, we're still literally waiting for the federal government to tell us what those rules are. This is a good time for everybody to start thinking about their own prioritization of those funds. And it may turn out that's ultimately not an exercise that leads to the specific deployment of dollars. But for my part, I've been thinking about how I would prioritize it if I could. First and foremost, household stability, making sure that people had adequate financial support in their house, not only for rents, but essential household expenditures as well. And obviously, small business resilience and recovery is critically important to the people of this community, since 80% of the people in our city work for small businesses. So those are two significant buckets that I would be interested in. The county will have its own set of essential must-haves as well. But the bottom line is, until we get the framework from the federal government, it's really hard for us to define how we would spend those dollars. But the process would be collaboration, both with you, with our Bureau directors, with Multnomah County, and identifying the highest and best use, the biggest bang for the buck at the local level in our community.
Sounds like a good plan.
It's as much of a plan as we've got. Thank you. All right, next we're going to get an update about the city budget on two fronts in particular. First, we're going to hear from our economist, Josh Harwood. He's going to tell us a little bit about the city's financial forecast for the next fiscal year, given what he knows at this moment. Second of all, we're going to hear from our budget director, Jessica Kennard, and she's going to tell us how we're approaching the budget this year to make sure we're building a responsible budget based on the information that we have at this time, recognizing that it's wildly incomplete, that we'll have much better information heading into the fall. Essentially, the briefing today is what's the math problem and what's our basic approach to solving it. And as I'm working to develop the proposed budget, particularly one that balances, I'm guided by what I believe are our shared priorities. That's protecting city jobs, doing the city's business better, making sure we're continuing our efforts to fight climate change and protect the environment. I want to center frontline communities who've been left off the list of priorities for way too long. I'm sure we all agree with that. And the goal is getting us to a city that is one that is in fact more equitable, that addresses the shared economic prosperity requirements, that makes sure that we're taking advantage of this opportunity to really enhance our environmental and our climate action goals and continue to move our city in the right direction. So I appreciate everybody's collaboration so far, and I look forward to sharing more in the next couple of weeks as the budget unfolds. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica. Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning, Mayor. Thank you. And good morning, Commissioners. For the record, Jessica Kennard, City Budget Director. I'm here with Josh Harwood, the City Economist, also on the line. So Josh, as you know, typically provides his general fund forecast, his first initial general fund forecast in November or December, and then updates it in February during the CBO review process, and then provides a final update in April. So the forecast update created in early February did not account for the COVID-19 impacts because we did not know at the time that we would be impacted in the way that we currently are. Josh has, over the past week, updated his forecast to reflect the anticipated impacts from COVID-19. As the mayor mentioned, and Josh will go into more detail around, there is still an incredible amount of uncertainty related to the forecast that's felt, of course, not just locally, but statewide and nationally as we address this public health crisis. After Josh provides his forecast update, I will also discuss at a high level how this forecast relates to the budget process. And council members, you should feel free to jump in with your questions at any time. This is a relatively brief presentation, but we want to have as robust a discussion as we can, given the information that we know. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh now. Josh?
Hey, can everybody hear me okay? Hopefully everybody can.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good.
Yes.
I just want to make sure. Yeah, I've had, as you know, technical difficulties with my computer, so I'm on my wife's computer today. But I think the important part to start with is the context of where we are. We're not even a month yet from the governor's order to stay home, so it's still pretty early and things are pretty fluid. We know certain economic data, but we don't know a ton yet. We're getting conflicting data depending on the survey date even. So I think that's a really important context for people to understand is that this is what we call an off-model event. So this is not something that we can just sort of stick into a black box and spit out a revenue forecast. This is a little more art than science at this point, and so we're working through it. I'm in constant contact with my colleagues at the state and at the county, and we're trying to navigate it as best we can, and that's all we can do, I think, at this point. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands the context of where we are. We know that one of the points we know is that traffic through the airport is down 94% from a year ago. So we know certain revenue impacts to things like lodging taxes that we know is happening today. We know in talking with Chris at PBOT and their group, we know that they're hitting impacts today, but there's less certainty around other impacts around business license taxes, around property taxes. The property tax system here is unique, and so it should be okay. But we're definitely going to see higher delinquencies, especially on the commercial side. That's where I'm most worried about. I think the overarching sort of context of this is we need to think about this differently than we've thought about other recessions. It is a different type of animal, and so that's what I think we're trying to get our arms around a little bit. The other sort of just monkey wrench in this is the extension of the tax deadline to July 15th. Normally this time of year we would have a lot more context about where we are, and we just don't as much. The numbers coming in look pretty good so far, frankly, and that's because mostly our tax base for business license taxes is based on 2019 economic activity, and it's a pretty high-ended tax. So it's a tax that we've got 60,000 accounts, about 500 or 400 or 500 pay about 50% of the taxes. So for most of those accounts, we're looking pretty good so far for this year, but I'm still obviously concerned about next year. Jessica, you can click to the next slide. So this is why I want to say we need to think about this a little bit differently. This is just initial claims for unemployment insurance. You can see that.
Hey, Josh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I feel like there's an important clarification that I need to make. When you say this year, you're referring to the current fiscal year, which ends at the end of June. Yes, I am. Yes. Sorry if I wasn't clear about that, but yes, absolutely. And so there's certain parts of the city that have more immediate problems. The general fund is actually a little bit more sustainable, and gives us a little bit more room to be more thoughtful about how we may want to deal with the crisis. The initial claims for unemployment insurance here, I mean, it's more than twice as big as the height of the last Great Recession. But there is a large component of that is basically furloughed employees. And so we that's why I say we need to think about this a little bit differently. Go ahead, Jessica. So this is the latest thinking out of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors about what we'll see. It depends on the revenue stream, but I think this is the discussion I've had, I think, with PBOT a little bit in particular, but it also will apply to some general fund sources as well, is that we'll see a little bit of a bounce back almost right away, but it's likely the level of unemployment and the level of uncertainty and human behavior essentially will likely mean that we will have a longer path to recovery to get back to where we were. I think we'll see a pretty quick bounce back in parts of the economy, but as Commissioner Daly said, I mean, I wouldn't want to be an owner of a music venue or a sports team or a handful of other sort of or Portland 5. It's going to be really hard for those things to come back very quickly. So I think there's a lot of room still to see full recovery. So as I just mentioned, I mean, I think the general fund revenues should mostly meet current year revenues as expected or budgeted. We mostly collected
we mostly collect taxes on prior COVID-19 activity. So the only exception is the lodging taxes, but lodging taxes are only about 6% of the general fund. So we should be able to manage through that for again, the current fiscal year. It's next year that I think the biggest problem is where we're going to see it, for the same reason, right? Because we mostly collect taxes on prior year issues. The immediate exceptions are parks and PBOT. Obviously, parks has closed all their community centers. They've lost all that revenue. They're in a little bit of a different space. PBOT, gas taxes, they collect more immediate sort of revenue sources. And then BDS is likely to follow. So BDS, most construction projects, because the governor's order extended are classified construction as an essential activity. They will likely finish most of the projects that they've started. They likely will not start another one. So BDS will, in my conversations with them, they're sort of expected to decline in 3 to 6 months. They're all likely to be slow to come back, all of those three, because of the nature of what they are. And so while we talk about general fund, and that's what we're talking about today primarily, there are other parts of the city that I think that the city council should be really aware of different impacts in different places. And so we're trying to be nuanced in how we talk about this, because it's going to be different in different revenue sources. And so it's not sort of a financial crisis that sort of hits everything in the same way. This is going to be a little more nuanced, and so I want to make sure that we understand that. Go ahead, Jessica. She's controlling this. So here's where we are. Here's where we are now. We've basically taken a 30% decrease in business license taxes for next year, which is about $45 million. I've talked to you all several times about how the fact that we're a little more exposed than we were during the last crisis. And that's why these numbers are a little bigger than they would otherwise be. Our two major revenue sources that are acutely dependent on the economics are business license taxes and transient lodging taxes, and we have now they make up about 35% of the general fund. During the last crisis, they made up about 23%. So we're just a little more exposed. And so I want to be clear that both this is still pretty conservative, I think, but also that the uncertainty is much bigger. So what we're looking at is a 30% decrease in business license taxes. A typical recession is about a 25% decline. I think the sharpness of this means that it'll be sharper faster. The hope is that it'll be sharper coming up as well. So I don't know that we'll see the same degree to which we have that kind of slow coming out of the financial crisis growth. I think we might be able to bounce back, particularly because the business license taxes. What we'll see, I think, is a transition from different taxpayers, and so I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but the taxpayers will change a little bit. So maybe go from financial institutions to Walmart and Kroger a little bit more. It'll be just a little bit different. We're also going to see a decrease of $20 million in lodging taxes. That one's harder to gauge exactly when that's going to come back. I have a feeling, and in discussions, it seems like that's going to have a longer tail. That people just won't travel as much. I mean, we've got, we're going to have hot spots, it sounds like, for a while in large swaths of the country. So that will make things, because of uncoordinated, basically, public health policies. So That's going to make it a little bit harder. The property taxes and utility license tax and franchise fees, I think we'll see increased delinquency rates, and so we've accounted for some of that. And ultimately, those are pretty difficult to figure out right now, but we've accounted for some increase in both of those. And they're a little bit different depending on the source. Ultimately, we expect about $75 million less in general fund revenue in 2021 than we did just 2 months ago. It's about a 13% decrease. So it's kind of in the window that we thought. And so I don't know, Jessica, if you want to move on to the next one.
I have a question before you move on,
Yeah.
please.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Thank you. My question has to do with the very conservative estimate of a 50% decline in transit lodging tax.
Yep.
And I'm assuming it's only because of the first quarter of this year, where people were traveling normally, that you have it at a 50%. I would see it more like a 95% decline.
Oh yeah, it is. It's about an 85% decline for this quarter, but
Okay.
for the year, for next year, we've basically cut it in half. We've basically taken it and gotten it to 2009 levels of.
So I think that's really optimistic, just because that's, I believe, will be the last industry to recover, just simply because of fear of gathering in large spaces at conventions and hotels and that sort of thing. So I just think that may be a little more optimistic than what the reality will be. So that was one question. The second question has to do with the assumption that all these businesses will make it through, and they will then be paying business income taxes. I think there's going to be a percentage of businesses that just won't recover from this economic crisis, and that hasn't been filtered in, I don't believe.
Oh, I think that's part of what we've tried to do. I think the business license taxes, though, are they're a different tax base than it's not a local tax base necessarily. It's a broader tax base. So yes, I would agree with you, and that's why I was trying to articulate that the composition of payers will change. But there are companies that frankly are doing very well right now, and so it's just going to be a different animal. I mean, we've gotten huge payments for like the clean energy surcharge, for instance, based on those large companies. So I think I would agree with you. I think the small businesses and what Commissioner Daly was talking about, the small businesses are going to really struggle, and a lot of them will not pay. And that's sort of what we're working through when I talk with our revenue division about sort of the delinquency rates and those kinds of things. So no, I don't disagree with anything you said. So I just thought it was important to say what's not included in the forecast, and it's any of the federal stimulus that we've talked about. So we don't account for that in our general fund forecast. And so it sounds like we're still working through sort of how and what we can use that for. And also, this is just a narrow scope of city uses and city services. And so I just thought it was important to highlight the fact that it doesn't go into the non-general fund impacts. They're going to be different depending on the individual bureau. Generally, though, I think the important part is to realize that the city's revenue streams are way more resilient than most other local governments and certainly the state. So we're not going to be great. I'm not going to highlight that, but we're going to be better off than most. And so, but where we are, we just don't know the duration of the shutdown, and that's, or the human behavior that happens afterwards. I mean, we've seen in China, you can give people $1,200 checks all you want, but if they're not willing to go outside and go to restaurants, it doesn't matter. So that component of it is something that I think we're still kind of figuring out. This is really in flux right now. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. It's the most uncertainty I've experienced. I never thought I would long for November 2008 or something again, but that's the reality. Is that that's where we are. So we're doing the best we can. I'm trying to capture all of the best thinking that exists. I think we are a little bit more dependent on tourism in Portland than we probably ever have been, and so I take Commissioner Hardesty, I take your comments to heart. That I think that's going to be the hardest thing to sort of get back, and so this is just where we are right now. We're gonna constantly reevaluate. I would have given you a different forecast a week ago. I might give you a different forecast a week from now. But this is sort of where we are based on the best thinking that we can put together. So I'm happy to answer any more questions. I'm obviously always available if you guys want to reach out. This is the best thinking that we can put together at this point.
Commissioner Hardesty, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mayor. I've already asked my question.
All right, thank you. Anybody else?
So unless there's a question, I'll just move to what this means for the budget and the budget process. So obviously, even though we may be in a better spot than some other government entities, solving for a $75 million reduction is substantial, particularly given the timing and the need to do so relatively quickly. The good news is we're coming out of an expansionary period, and so we're adjusting to a time when we had expanding and growing revenues. So the first thing that we will do is we'll eliminate our forecasted revenues, which were about $28.5 million. And so what we're really looking at in terms of cuts and reductions is a little under $50 million. And then what I've set up here is sort of the sequential approach that my office has been working through with the mayor as we seek to develop his proposed budget. And so what we're looking to do first is to capture as much current year savings as possible, trying to make sure that we're slowing all of our non-essential spending on materials and services. There's a hiring freeze for a number of positions across the city. We're looking again just to slow our spending and try to set us up to be in the best possible position when we know more information. Similarly, we're looking first to reallocate non-urgent program and policy set-asides. So the council has done a really admirable job in the last couple of years of setting aside some funding for known liabilities that aren't urgent, but we know will be needed at some point in the future. This is the time when we can deploy those resources to sort of minimize the pain that we feel, knowing that we will have to replenish them, but trying to smooth the decline into this cliff. So we're looking at those types of strategies. We're also looking to freeze inflationary increases, and we're looking to do this because we want to preserve as many jobs and services as possible. We hold firm that particularly right now, we want as many people to retain access to their healthcare benefits and other benefits as possible for them and their families. So that's the thinking behind kind of holding steady on some of our COLA, both for materials and services and for wages, as well as merit and step, trying to hold things constant as much as possible. And then include, in general, we're looking to include as many reductions as feasible this spring through the proposed, approved, and adopted. Again, trying to set us up to be in the best position in the fall, knowing that there remains a lot of uncertainty, knowing that the $75 million number is conservative, but it's also, to Josh's point, there is still so much uncertainty. In light of that, what we are looking to do is to establish renewed Bureau programmatic reduction targets in anticipation of the fall. So what we are doing is, again, taking as many reductions as we can right now to set us up to be in the best possible position. But then likely, if we're unable to get to that full $75 million, we don't want to take action that is not well thought out and extremely disruptive if we don't know if we have to take those reductions yet. So we're trying to strike that balance between taking as many reductions to set us up to be in the best position possible while trying to do things in a really thoughtful and measured way. And so what that means is that there will likely be a need for additional reduction targets for the fall when we know more information. And so a big part of this is not just the evolving forecast, as Josh alluded to, but the extension of the tax filing deadline to July. And what that means is we won't know our full receipts. We won't know where we'll land in this fiscal year. We obviously still don't know what the rules are and how much money will come from the federal government that we can use to support our operations or our revenue challenges. So the thinking is that once we know all of that information, will probably be towards the end of this fiscal year, the beginning of next fiscal year, we will open up the budget again as part of our fall process and look to true it up and take additional reductions as needed and move forward in that way. So it's a challenge. Obviously, this is not territory that I think any of us envisioned we would be in right now. And I don't know that we've ever been in a position quite like this before. But we're really holding fast to the idea that we want to be as flexible as possible and be measured and thoughtful in our decision making around solving for this crisis. I am able to answer questions to the best of my ability. And I'm sorry, I didn't, while I was talking, I haven't had the participant window up, so I'm not sure if anybody has their hand raised.
This is Commissioner Hardesty. I just want to say I greatly appreciate the work of you and your team. You've been very, very thoughtful and very open with the hard choices that the council will have to make as we move through this process. And I just want to say thank you. I feel you've done an excellent job of laying out the challenge in front of us. And I think it's up to us, the council, to actually have a vision of where we're moving towards. This is going to be hard. It's going to be tough for a lot of folks. But I think the more that we can articulate not just the challenge that we're in at the moment, but the vision about where we're moving towards, I think would be very helpful.
Commissioner Daly.
Thank you, Mayor. I also want to thank Director Kennard and the Budget Office for their guidance and their calm. There may be an instinct to immediately kind of overcorrect for the coming impacts, but I hope that we are looking at what the city did during the recession as a kind of case study for what we should and should not do. I don't know about the rest of the bureaus, but I've now overseen 2 bureaus, BDS and PBOT, who are still dealing with the reverberating effects of drastic cuts that were made during the recession that, you know, may have shaved some dollars off the budget, but really debilitated the bureaus. So I guess, yeah, I'd appreciate just ongoing guidance around that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner. And we will certainly continue conversations with your office and other offices. And just as Josh offered, I am also available at any time to have a conversation with you all about broad concerns or specific ones to the best of my ability.
right, any other questions? Good presentation, thank you. Does that complete your presentation for today then?
Yes, it does. I will stop sharing now. Here we go.
All right, I want to thank all of our presenters today from both the budget shop, the economic shop, as well as our government relations shop. Appreciate it very much. And if there's nothing else, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.